Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel the 4-decade story of the Taliban. It's a really complex story of war, faith, and a cycle of foreign powers that has left a huge mark on Afghanistan and on the world. So let's start with this date, August 15th, 2021. The scenes were just dramatic, and honestly, for a lot of people, pretty shocking. You had Taliban fighters just pouring into the Afghan capital, taking over the presidential palace with incredible speed. And just like that, a 20-year Western-backed government was over. And that really brings us to the central question, the one that still hangs in the air. How was this even possible? I mean, after 2 whole decades and trillions of dollars spent building a new Afghan state, how did it all just unravel in a few weeks? To really understand how we got here, we have to go back, way back. See, the story of the Taliban doesn't really begin in 2001 or even in the 90s. Its roots are actually in another invasion, another war that totally set the stage for everything to come. All right, let's dive right in. We're starting in the late 1970s. Why here? Because this is the moment the modern cycle of violence in Afghanistan really got set in motion. You can just see the dominoes falling right here. It all kicks off with a communist coup in '78. A year later, the Soviet Union invades to prop up that struggling regime. Well, that invasion sparks a brutal 10-year war, which ends with the Soviets pulling out, totally defeated. Then just a few years after that, the government they left behind completely collapses, leaving this massive power vacuum. And here's the really tragic irony. The very same fighters who had united to fight the Soviets, they immediately turned their guns on each other. You had warlords battling for control of Kabul, battling for the whole country, plunging it into a whole new level of chaos and destruction. Now, a key thing to remember about the mujahideen is that they weren't one unified army. Not at all. They were this fractured alliance of militias and warlords, all with competing agendas. The only thing that really united them was driving out the Soviets. And of course, because this was the Cold War, the US and its allies were more than happy to pour in weapons and money to help them do just that. So you have to imagine what it was like on the ground for regular people. Constant violence, rampant corruption, warlords just terrorizing the population. It created this deep, profound desperation. People were desperate for anyone who could just stop the chaos. And it's right out of this desperation that a brand new, powerful, and pretty radical force emerged, promising to deliver that exact thing. Order. This new group popped up out of the southern city of Kandahar in 1994. They called themselves the Taliban, which means students. And they presented themselves as these religious purifiers, a movement that would just sweep away all the corrupt warlords and put in a pure form of Islamic law. And right here, you can see this stark contrast between their public promise and the reality of their power. On one hand, they vowed to end corruption, to bring back order. But on the other hand, they were getting heavy backing from Pakistan's intelligence services. And unlike those other mujahideen factions, they had a single, unified command structure. That combination, it proved to be incredibly effective. Their momentum was just staggering. Think about it. To a population that was just utterly exhausted by years of war, their simple promise of order was intoxicating. They swept across the country, overran the disorganized warlords, and by 1996, they'd seized the capital, Kabul. Their first time in charge was defined by some really extreme social policies and almost complete international isolation. They imposed this brutal and rigid interpretation of Islamic law, banning women from public life, carrying out public executions, destroying cultural heritage. And, crucially, for what came next, they gave safe haven to Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network. And that alliance with al-Qaeda, well, that brings us to a pivotal moment that would change the course of history, not just for Afghanistan, but for the entire world. So after the 9/11 attacks, the world's attention just snapped right to Afghanistan. The US delivered an ultimatum: hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused. The response was swift and it was overwhelming. A US-led coalition, partnering up with the Taliban's old rivals in the Northern Alliance, toppled their entire regime in a matter of weeks. But the fall of Kabul in 2001, that was not the end of the story. Not even close. In fact, it was the beginning of a long, incredibly complex, and costly war that would last for 2 decades. For those 2 decades, you kind of had this strange stalemate. It was like there were 2 different Afghanistans. On one side, you had the internationally backed government that controlled the cities, but it was plagued by corruption and was totally dependent on foreign support. On the other side, you had the Taliban insurgency, which regrouped in the countryside using guerrilla tactics and framing themselves as a nationalist resistance fighting a foreign occupation. The beginning of the end really came with the 2020 Doha Agreement. And here's a super crucial detail. The US negotiated this deal directly with the Taliban. They completely sidelined the very Afghan government they were supposed to be supporting. It locked in a timeline for an American withdrawal, but those promised peace talks between the Taliban and the government, they never really happened, leaving the Afghan government fatally exposed. And this, of course, brings us full circle, right back to where we started, the summer of 2021, and the final dramatic chapter of this 20-year war. So why did it all fall apart so fast? Well, as soon as the final U.S. withdrawal began, the dominoes fell with stunning speed. The Afghan army was an institution that was completely dependent on U.S. air support and logistics. Without it, their morale just evaporated. And as the Taliban launched this lightning-fast offensive, the government and its military just melted away. And the result is this incredible, stunning, historical echo. After 20 years, trillions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, the very same group that was kicked out in 2001 was once again raising its flag over Afghanistan. The cycle was complete. This chart really highlights the similarities between their two times in power. I mean, look at the governance model, still centered on a supreme leader. Look at women's rights, where they were once banned from education and work, girls are now banned from going to secondary school. And internationally, they're just as isolated, with no formal recognition from any major world power. It seems that while the world changed, the Taliban's core ideology really didn't. So, what's the big takeaway from all this history? Well, first, the Taliban was born from the chaos of a previous war. Second, their return is a really stark lesson in the limits of trying to build a nation through military force. And finally, it proves that in Afghanistan, a patient insurgency with a strong local ideology can outlast even the world's most powerful armies. And that leaves us with this final, lingering thought. After more than 40 years of turmoil, driven by these repeating cycles of invasion, civil war, and insurgency, the fundamental question about how to achieve a lasting, inclusive peace for the Afghan people remains profoundly unanswered.